Hey, how's everyone doing? I'm Ella Feingold. This is my orchestration partner, Jordan Cox.
Hey,
And we were just going to kind of riff a little bit about woodwinds, just some of the trend in using them, how we use them, how a lot of times we don't use them, why we don't use them, um, sort of maybe some of the orchestral typecasting that we see with woodwinds, where we see sort of some of the same roles given to the woodwinds over and over again, and maybe suggesting ways that they can be helpers, where they can be the glue between sections, or, for example, helping something, project or completing a chord or whatnot, or as a way of muting the brass. So I would say maybe just offering up some general tips to composers that maybe would like some more suggestions of how to use a flute or how to use an oboe or something like that, other than say melodically. So I guess maybe we could kind of just talk about why they're not used that often anymore today. And before we get into like, yeah, how do you and I like to use an oboe?
yeah. I think like I think the funny part about woodwinds is if you ask composers now, and I guess I would say sort of young composers, maybe
Yeah.
where like 20s to mid 20s, so sort of in there, and you say and you ask them about woodwinds in the orchestra. I think the first thing that comes to mind, as we joke a lot about, is the John Williams woodwind runs in terms of film scoring. Okay, in terms of
Sure, sure.
everyone thinks of E.T. and Jurassic Park and all those, Star Wars, all those the flutes and piccolos and the clarinets and everybody doing all those crazy runs, and they think, oh, that's all woodwinds can do. And we both know that's not true. Especially a lot of people don't know I also am a flute player,
Yeah.
and the I love woodwinds, and not only am I an animation composer where I just think the woodwinds truly shine. I think that what happened is that it's sort of in the 90s when the film scores were big, and I guess the golden age of film scoring. So when the film scores were large and boisterous, and they had
Golden age for us, by the way, because for some people, the 1940s, the 30s, yeah, yeah, I don't want to get chewed out.
so to speak, the second golden age. But a lot
Yeah.
of movies that you and I grew up on in the 80s and such, the 80s was a different weird time. I feel like, some of the early scores were so synthy, and then mid 80s is like, it's James Horner kind of was coming in, and John Williams again. I'm not entirely sure uh, what started the change. All I know is that sort of in the 90s, you just hear any film score you listen to for the most part, it just seems that the woodwinds are doing eccentric runs and arpeggiations and things like that. That maybe was just the sound of it. And I know I'm generalizing. I know that I'm sure there's film composers that are going to be like, no way, that's not true. But I'm overgeneralizing. It's just it seems
Yeah.
a lot of the 90s scores kind of fit that character for the woodwinds. And when we moved out of orchestral film scoring, and what I mean by that is sort of into the 2000s and 2010s and stuff, you can see a trend that we were using less of an orchestra in our film scores, and especially in our TV.
Mhm.
Breaking Bad's a good example of being almost an entirely, I think, maybe for the most part, a synth, television score. And sort of everybody kind of um, picking up on sort of what Hans started with the synth things, and the orchestra changed. The orchestra changed, and as sample libraries were coming up, I think that that's sort of the biggest influence of what happened is that it was really easy for a composer who didn't have a lot of training per se to sit down and play a pad on a strings pad or a brass pad and it sound good. And our writing tendency, I think, went that way. And I think that I'm not trying to rip on composers by any means. I just think that what happened is it was easier to get a lot more music out quicker not using the woodwinds. And maybe it's also twofold. I do know that a lot of directors and producers started to get scared of the woodwind sound.
I mean, I've even had composers tell me, we don't like woodwinds because we don't want to sound like John Williams, which is just insane. Like, it's like saying we don't like using adverbs because whatever, we're just going to extract nouns because we don't want to sound like we're speaking English or so. I don't know. It was just insane.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that, not to cut you off, but that one, as you know, as orchestrators, we know how to hide the woodwinds and we also know how to make them really project. And that sampling is pretty good nowadays for some things, but you can play a string pad, your Spitfire, Spiccato, or Sultasto, Super Flautando patch, or your Adventure Brass 10-horn patch, and things are sellable and sound good. But to be honest, when you go to certain libraries and you pick the woodwind high or woodwind low patch, it sounds like a really bad pipe organ. And there's all kinds of awful doublings. And so a composer's not going to be inspired to play the patch. Now, of course, we're talking about people that aren't comfortable with woodwinds and they're not really sure. And, let's be real, there's been a lot of people that I've worked for over the years that said, like, Ella, I'm not comfortable with the woodwinds. I don't really understand how to use them. We have them for this project. Do whatever you need to do with them. And a lot of times, the patches don't sound great. So I would say to sample makers, like, please, for the aid of composers, make a patch that's just double reeds and make a patch that's not, with just flutes and clarinets and the whole choir. So it's like we have something that's, tart and something that's, sweet, or whatever descriptors you want to use. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but as you know, as a cellist, and as orchestrators, we often go to the cello patch when we're orchestrating, because that's where people go to first, because it's chunky and it sounds good. So some things are as simple as, like, people don't like the patches, and then the woodwinds get just completely wiped out just from a simple patch, or they don't know how to hide the woodwinds. And Conrad Pope likes to say that, he says something like, anyone can make the strings sound good, and then next the brass, but you earn your money as an orchestrator with the woodwinds, because things don't naturally balance. And you were talking about Hans and stuff, and I think not only did the color palette change with the orchestra, but the role changed in terms of just the stamina that you need to play some of the music. And I think this is a great thing to have the orchestra evolve. I love Hans. I mean, Interstellar is one of my favorite soundtracks, but it's almost as if the orchestra became Metallica. The strings either became like a Vangelis CS80 sequencer, where there are all these intricate motors and ostinati happening, or they became Metallica, and just heavy, chunky things. That sort of what we called upon them to do, became different. Not to get in on strings, but I think that's a big thing as well.
It's a good point because, by the way, Hans knows how to use woodwinds, everyone. Like
Yeah, of course.
this isn't a diss to him at all. What it is, I think, happens is that, when you look at the orchestra, strings are a very homogeneous sound. This is why I'm going to use my students as an example. I get students who come in and play a C, or C major chord in the string pad, and they say that's what the violas do, and then they put a string melody on top and a bass and cello and octaves below, right? Okay, your mock-up actually sounds pretty good. Strings are fairly homogeneous. Brass, a little bit less homogeneous, but generally, if you put things in triads, they sound pretty good in a sample library. I'm talking specifically in sample libraries. Where the woodwind stunt people is that not one woodwind sounds like the other. A flute sounds nothing like an oboe sounds nothing like a clarinet, and don't even get into the auxiliary instruments. I mean, people will say, oh, a piccolo is just a high flute. No, a piccolo is a completely different instrument. A low piccolo does not sound like a mid-range or high flute at all. That is its own color. I really get kind of frustrated when my students will say, oh, well, the piccolo just plays higher, so you use that when you want it to sound high. Well, yes, to an extent, but it's its own color. English horn is a completely different color from an oboe. And contrabassoon, bass clarinets, oh my goodness, I mean, they are nothing like a regular clarinet, in my opinion. So you have four different, primary woodwind instruments that sound nothing like each other. And in fact, I remember at USC, Bruce Broughton always said too in the orchestration classes, he'd say, writing for the woodwind quartet, and he made us do a quartet, not a quintet, by the way, a quintet having the horn. He'd say, this is going to be the hardest thing you ever do. Because number one, a bassoon is not a bass instrument. It's just not. And there's not one of these colors will really match itself. I mean, you can do certain things to get a clarinet and a bassoon to sound similar. You can, they do in certain ranges, but overall, if all four instruments are playing, they don't sound alike. So I think for composers, that's really tricky when you're writing a film score and you're thinking, what do I have to think of the oboe specifically as an oboe and a flute specifically as an oboe, whereas I can just sit down and think strings. And
Right.
a lot of people think like that. And the other part of why this changed, I think, in Hollywood too, by the way, is that it wasn't so much that composers were changing. I think what happened is directors and producers would go back and listen to the 90s films and say, it sounds too emotional. Don't do that. And really what part of that was a lot of the soloistic writing. I think a lot of those like early Disney Renaissance period, like Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and stuff, some of the the great oboe playing I think that happened in a lot of James Horner scores, that was sort of a no-no for directors because they said, well, I don't want it to feel too emotional because heaven forbid the music sound emotional, right? So
Yeah.
what happened is a lot of the woodwinds carried the weight of that. If you look at a lot of beautiful woodwind writing, it as orchestrators we know how to color and hide it, and that's a if you're score studying, look at John Williams scores for that too, how he hides the bassoons and things like that. Obviously you can even go to Ravel for the master of all of that, but in film scoring it's sad, it's an oboe solo, string pad underneath, that went away unless you
Yeah, and I think that because all of them have completely different colors that, and I think it's a Bernard Rogers book. I think that's his name, called The Art of Orchestration. But he says woodwinds, the intimate voices of the orchestra. And it's like, they can be like soloists, whereas you were saying with strings being homogenous, like it's a choir,
Mhm.
where at times woodwinds are the intimate voices. They're like soloists, they're all, it's like I mean, sometimes I just say it's like a motley crew, and they don't balance with each other. And I was saying in another video how there's this axis. So like, well, wait a minute. So I'm a beginning orchestrator. So you're telling me when these people go high, they get louder, but these people over here, when they go higher, they get quieter?
Oh
Like,
yeah,
wait, you know what I mean? And so there's
it
so
almost
much consideration that goes in care.
and that's exactly what I think it is it actually requires a little bit more forethought in how you use the woodwinds. My brother, as I've mentioned in the other video, is an oboist, and I remember um we did a bunch of competitions growing up, like the Schubert, all that kind of stuff. And I remember we played the Hinastera flute and oboe duo, and very tough piece. And I remember that we could not match our articulations, and of course we were younger at the time too. And I remember realizing that an oboe articulates shorter than a flute player. A flute player can out tongue an oboe player. Sorry,
Sure.
a flute player can triple tongue like nobody's business, but an oboe player is so short in their staccato that it's it's almost unmatchable. So not only do our articulations not match,
Yeah.
but again with strings, it's all in the right hand. Our bowing, our articulations, we can do that. Same with brass. It's like they have a little bit because they have a piece in front of their mouth that's relatively the same. They articulate relatively the same. An oboe player has a reed in their mouth. It's right there by their tongue. A flute player does not have anything. They have a little bit more of a reach to get to. So your articulations don't even match. So forget color. Your articulations don't even match. You're already at like this
Very good point. Yeah.
disadvantage. So I think as a composer, it requires a little bit more forethought in terms of you have to sort of do a lot of additional listening and studying with the woodwinds. And in film scoring, we already had like one of our legs chopped off by having producers and directors saying, whoa, we don't like any of these beautiful sounds for the solos. So I kind of feel bad for composers during that time, and sort of now where, okay, well, we took away the oboe solo and the flute solo because it sounds too pretty or sad. Now what do I do with the woodwinds? Am I going to really hire woodwind players to just color chords? And honestly, from a budget perspective, I get why that didn't happen, and
Mhm.
why you would see in many film scoring sessions no woodwinds, be eight horns and four trumpets. I've worked on huge projects with literally 16 horns and six trumpets and 14 trombones and four chimbassos and 65 strings and four woodwinds,
Yeah, one alto flute. Yeah, yeah.
and then a choir and four woodwind players to just like play some solos here and there. And I'm talking big budget films. And
Sure.
again, it's because directors and producers got scared. And not only that, but composers were sort of at this disadvantage of being like, okay, do I hire eight players to just color something when I don't have the budget, first of all, or is that worth my time to sit and try to figure out where the two bassoons are going to color two horns and things like that? Again, you're writing on a tight deadline. You already have less time to think about that, and you're not allowed to write an oboe solo anymore. So it's sort of like,
Yeah.
it's like a funneling thing. It's like all this stuff happened at once. So for those of you kind of watching who are into film scoring, like, you've probably noticed that, like, we just don't use woodwinds. I mean, I've even worked on some films lately where we don't even use violins. We use viola, cello, and bass because the violins are too bright for the producers. I mean, that's a legitimate thing. Or
Sure.
we use trombones and strings because they're a little bit more gnarly because horns are too sweet or too pretty. And
Or we've worked on projects where the trumpet is almost never used
ever,
because,
yep, because it's too bright. So I'm sort of siding with the composers on this. Like, you're being told to not do certain things, but when these instruments lend themselves to those things, like, you don't have a choice really to not use them. Obviously, in animated scores, we have woodwinds, and I think that as an animation composer myself, that's like one of the joys, is to play around with the woodwinds, is because they have so many unique colors and combinations. But if you're not doing animation music, that's just not going to work. So,
yes.
like we said, I think that that's sort of what stemmed from that. And I know that some people probably are listening are maybe some wind band players. Like, you got to remember, wind band is different though. You might have 4 to 10 clarinets in a band. That does now sound like a choir. But you don't have that in an orchestra. You maybe have 2 or 3 clarinets, or if you're like us, you got like 5. So
Yeah, I mean, I should say that Jordan and I work on, well, we can't say what project, because just I know they're protective about their IP, but Jordan and I have been working on a project together for many years, and we have both fought for a lot of woodwinds and all the auxiliaries, and we have woodwinds in 4, and it's almost unheard of in this day and age, and we use them in a lot of different ways, to color things as a way of muting things. And, I think we're both very lucky because that's not the norm, having winds and fours,
it's not, and
with all the auxiliaries too,
right.
it's,
And we've both had to sort of, relinquish a little bit of our love for woodwinds, I think, and sort of have the gray matter at times, because that is a sound, for
yep,
those listening.
absolutely.
Obviously, I love John Williams. I love James Horner. I love woodwinds, but my job is not to necessarily make someone's music sound like that. It's
Of
to,
course, yeah.
so we have to respect the composers, and we have to also just respect that this is a trend right now too. I might not like it, but we have to now orchestrate slightly differently. We don't get to
We
write
do, yeah.
certain solos. We have to maybe cloud things a bit more in terms of the middle range of the woodwinds. Anything that sounds too high in the flutes might sound getting close to Star Wars at times, and so we can't do that. So we have to be a little bit more mindful now, I think, as orchestrators, because the composers, like I said, are at a disadvantage of, they're not allowed to do these certain things, because somehow they're fighting production on these kind of hilarious sort of stigmas.
Yeah, no, it is crazy. I mean, hopefully things will change. Small note, like I have a love-hate relationship with sample libraries because certain composers just think that that is the truth. They think that their 10 horn or 12 trombone patch is going to sound the same as 4 horns in the room that they've hired, or the Cine samples, Cinebrass, monster low brass articulation, where maybe they sampled this note and then they stretched it down 12 semitones, and they expect that those trombone pedals are actually going to speak and articulate, and they don't. And we could make a whole nother video about how we deal with that. But I do like some of the woodwind stuff that Spitfire's been doing, at least with their evolution things, where they have these sort of John Adams-y things where there's all, and it was orchestrated by Ben Foskett, where, yeah, you hold down a chord and there's all these clarinets playing really breathy subtone and pitch bending things, and, double reeds kind of maybe doing like a Morse code kind of popping over it. And I feel like that's given us at least an opportunity to orchestrate some of that stuff, because they can sell that woodwind writing because it's pads and it's evolving. And I guess, it's really it sounds like from what you're talking about, and certainly what I experience, is that with woodwinds, people don't want them to be the intimate voices of the orchestra, and they don't want them above the treble clef or even in the treble clef. And those are two big ways to avoid that problem. We've worked on some stuff, and sometimes we just do monster low winds. I mean, if you listened to the Godzilla score, the one from 2014, I know some of the stuff that you work on, it's just nothing but low winds, 2 contrabassoons, 2 bassoons, contrabass clarinet, contra alto clarinet, and 2 bass clarinets. And maybe there's like some alto and bass flutes. And there's some composers that, love to just do low winds. And there's some composers, no name mentioned, where they just don't want double reeds. They'll just do like a clarinet choir and like a ton of flutes, but no bassoons, no oboes or heckelphone or cor anglais, because it sounds too like grandpa reedy, like medieval, and there's
That's
different fashions with just some of the colors.
That kind of goes into your typecast, of the orchestra. I think that that's actually more common, honestly. I find that, again, animation aside, if we're recording a larger film, you will see flutes and clarinets and not oboes. I think oboe is the first instrument to go now, which
Yeah.
I have oboe is one of my favorite instruments. I have a professional oboist in the family, so it's really hard because some of my favorite scores are the oboe solos from, and I think that what happened is, not only is the oboe such a specific instrument, it's a specific sound. Flutes and clarinets they're more adaptable. You also got to remember flute and clarinet are also more versatile. If where do you find flute besides orchestral music? Well, you find it in pop and jazz, and you find clarinet in other things as well. So those instruments lend themselves not only to just pure orchestral music, they have sounds that probably more people are familiar with. And when people hear an oboe,
That's a great point. Yeah, big band music, and
and they
the
think
clarinet being part of the sax soli, and Benny
that.
Goodman.
Yep. So when people hear an oboe and maybe a bassoon, they think, 1990s film score John Williams kind of thing.
Or
And
just Beethoven.
yeah, yeah, maybe even as far back. And I have had directors tell me that, oh, well, it sounds too classical. And
Sure, I
I
get
have
that
to
all
take
the
out,
time.
yep,
Yeah.
an oboe solo, then it sounds fine. And I think that's kind of, it's unfortunate that the oboe and the bassoon have maybe been put into those categories as too musical, maybe,
Yeah.
because a flute and clarinet can hide, and that's sort of how we're orchestrating for them now too. You might see a flute solo here and there, but you're seeing a lot more synth-like motion in a flute and a clarinet in terms, like you said, some of these Spitfire patches. Like when
Yeah.
you orchestrate it that way, it's less orchestral, but they do play,
You're right. And even going to the 60s with Henry Mancini, and Klaus Obermann arranging for like Jobim and all of those records, that was in vogue, and I mean, and still in vogue today, of using like 4 alto flutes in unison or 5 bass flutes in unison, to the point where the players even went out and bought all of the same instrument. And to me, when I hear that sound, it sounds like a Moog patch. It sounds, because you mentioned synth, like it almost sounds synth-like. There's some Klaus Ogerman scores where it'll be like 4 alto flutes in unison with 1 trombone being instructed to play horn-like, with a little more breath and whatever. And, obviously not portmanteauing to notes. And to me, it's like when I first heard that sound without looking at those scores, many, many years ago, I was like, what is that sound? It's like otherworldly, and it sounds like a synth. And I think that's kind of just what, some composers have to sell to directors, and what directors want. Like as long as you can hide the woodwinds so that they sound like a synth, whether it's the Spitfire patches or like doubling up on 3 alto flutes and having some pitch bend and breath, like anything that's going to sound like a synth, you can sort of sell the sound, which, and maybe it just becomes that it's just other sounds are too obtrusive, and they, I don't know, they just project too much, and it's taking away from the subtlety, of what they want, which goes into a whole nother compositional style of things that are memorable versus things that if they're gone, you notice it, but it's composition where you're not obviously supposed to notice it.
Yeah. And I think that kind of like what you mentioned with when composers, are being told, don't be too emotional. Music, the problem too is that the style of music has changed. I've gotten my favorite is when you get you get a demo and it'll say, we want a unique sound, something, something that has that is specific to this project. And then you come up with a unique sound and they don't like it, and then you do something orchestral and they say, okay, that's what we're looking for. That's often what happens. I think, any composer watching this is probably shaking their head like, oh yes, every single time. Producers and directors don't really, I feel like, want something brand new like that. I think what they're looking for is just a signature to their show, and it puts composers, I think, in a problem of the woodwinds being so specifically orchestral that no matter whatever they do with them, it's going to sound like John Williams, or like you said, or pick your composer from pre
whatever your reference point is for.
But it sounds too classical to them, and a string pad under an EDM beat sounds new. So again, composers are sort of at this disadvantage that they have to adapt with what's happening. And so for those composers who are lucky enough to get to work with woodwinds, we unfortunately have to just use them in ways that we normally wouldn't. And I know that especially being in LA, a lot of my favorite players, my favorite woodwind pals, like I know they're struggling with this in terms of just being like, where do I fit in as a woodwind player right now? And I know the pendulum tends to swing back. I find that, we've got a lot of really great young composers like, Austin Wintry, people coming up who know how to write for woodwinds and are kind of champions of that. And like, I hope that it does change. I feel like we are changing that way. And so maybe we'll get lucky and get to have some more oboe solos and things again like that soon.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can kind of just riff and go down the list of ways that as orchestrators we use the woodwinds when they're not being assigned solo roles, like how we hide them, how we use them to color things, ghost things. So I don't know, maybe I'll start, but like maybe we get something menacing and we use 3 piccolos up high doing some kind of flutter tongue and pitch bend thing, and it doesn't sound like piccolos, it just sounds like a hornet's nest. Or using piccolos in its lowest range. I mean, again, I know we can't mention the project, but remember, when we got 3 piccolos and we used them in the lowest range in unison, and it just had this beautiful haunting sound, and the composers, even the conductor, was like, whoa, I've never heard anything like, we need to use that a lot more. And it's like, it's a piccolo. That would probably be the first thing you would think to just get off of the instrumentation, and like those are just two ways, especially piccolo in the low range, with a couple of them in unison. Such a cool underused sound, and that's why we score read. But again, I feel kind of like I don't know, like an old person being like, that's why you got to score read. But sometimes it's not score reading. Like people just don't want the woodwinds, and it's not about using your imagination with woodwinds. Sometimes you just get fired if you use them. But
Yeah. Well, and often I think in our role, as an orchestrator, that's sometimes something we don't even get to decide. Often I find that we get a project, hey, the composer comes and says, okay, here's my project. We're going to record in, March, and we're doing just strings.
yeah,
Or now we're adding brass. And you say, okay, you don't, I mean, depending on your relationship with the composer, and honestly, even I have good relationships with some of these composers, that's not my battle to fight, to say let's add
sure,
woodwinds, because they've probably already fought that battle, and they
absolutely.
probably don't want to, like, they don't probably want to hear from the orchestrator the battering on the pain that they're already feeling for not getting some woodwinds. So sometimes
Yeah,
we're just left without even being able to do that.
yeah. No, I think this would be fun to just kind of riff about, for those that are maybe beginning orchestrators, how to use woodwinds in ways that you maybe aren't accustomed to. And maybe if you're a composer, whether you're just doing mock-ups and not using an orchestra, or you are eventually going to use an orchestra and you have no idea how to use woodwinds, maybe these are like patch suggestions of things that you could
Yeah.
try. So I mean, yeah, I think oboes, yeah, I would love to sell people on, using a library where it's piccolos, but in the lowest register. Do you have any other things with piccolos that you like to use other than adding brilliance and
Yeah. I do I work a lot in horror and thriller films. I love, like I mentioned, I am a flute player. Like, I love rolling of the head joints in and outs with piccolos, flutes as well, in maybe their lower range. But there's something really haunting about a piccolo playing a straight tone with non-vibrato and kind of bending, rolling their head joint, so they're bending the pitch just ever so slightly. I mean, it's kind of, we never say a quarter tone because it might be more or less depending on how much that player can roll the head joint. But it's a really eerie sound. These tricks don't necessarily have to work only for horror and thriller films. Even Piccolo's sustaining chords up high, non vibrato. Piccolo's maybe like a triad or something. Actually, a great score to check out is Pocahontas. Actually, the Disney film, pretty much everyone knows that. There's a lot of really great upper register piccolo writing, not too high where it hurts your ears, but sort of stuff that like may have been comfortable for a flute player, but it went to the piccolo, and it's really nice sounding. It has its like a sort of ethereal quality to it, I think, up there.
I think you actually kind of hit the nail on the head with non-vibrato, because vibrato is what I think we think of sometimes with woodwinds, and that's what gives them, a very characteristic sound. And I think I've noticed with composers that, when we write non-vib for the winds, at times it becomes otherworldly. It's like two bassoons on the bottom, two clarinets non-vib. It's like, whoa, it sounds like, the bourdon stop on a pipe organ. And so when we don't use vibrato, it's like, whoa, what is that sound? And I know that's maybe sort of a cheap suggestion, but just for composers, sometimes just not using vibrato on your patches is a way to, give it a completely different color.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know it's off topic from woodwinds, but that goes to strings as well. There are plenty of composers I've worked with who will say, "Oh, the strings are sounding too classical." I'm like,
Yeah.
"Classical? Yeah, like there's something too brilliant." Now knowing this and working a lot with certain composers, I will say, "Okay, let's do non-vibrato," and they say, "Oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what it is. Maybe it's
Yeah.
classical sounding for them."
Yeah. I love that in trumpet, like with a harmon mute and just marking it like cold, dead tone. And we could kind of go on a tangent how it's like emotionally strange for them when they're used to vibrating an instrument to not truly play with vibrato. It's like, I know some places we go, we say like non-espressivo, non-vibrato, dead tone, no life to the sound, like whatever, and we still get poco vib.
People still do it. Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's because you've spent your whole career, learning to make the sound vibrate and playing expressively. And
that's the string player saying is vibrato covers a multitude of sins.
it's true. Yeah.
You know, my
Anyway, so yeah, going down the line, I guess. So flute, I'm sure you'll have way more suggestions, but for me, I guess I mentioned having alto flutes, bass flutes, or just flutes in unison, like three of them, can have a very synth-like sound, especially if you ask them to play very breathy. But I love using flutes, in the low register, like the bottom fifth of the instrument, non-vibrato, and as a way of coloring harmonics, string harmonics. And one of my favorite sounds, like I'll use flutes either in unison with string harmonics or even give flute harmonics, if they're above the staff. But one of my favorite sounds is actually, if a composer has written string harmonics where maybe they are above the staff, to have flutes an octave below them playing non-vibrato, where they're sort of, the undertones of the chord is such a underexplored kind of sound. I think that's such a cool color.
even piggyback off in this, skipping over a couple of instruments, but bassoons doing that as well.
Yeah.
That with harmonics, bassoons, depending on how low the harmonics go, but bassoons playing relatively high, like right of spring high, it's a beautiful sound. Oh my goodness, the high bassoons. There's nothing as to me as pad like that people should use more often. Is like three bassoons playing.
Yeah, I was just saying in another video for like beginning orchestrators that, a lot of people think of the bassoon as like bass clef, bass instrument, score read like Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande, like the whole score is almost in alto clef, tenor clef rather,
It's a good point, is that, obviously knowing your instrument ranges is helpful, but also too, like we said, knowing that a piccolo can play low and wanting to use that color, it's different than a flute playing the same note in the same octave. It really is a different color. So
Yeah.
it's nice to know, for those people who are, getting into orchestration, think about really getting to know the woodwinds, because again, they have more color. I know this is orchestration 101, but they really do. Each octave, even less than an octave of each instrument, has its own unique color, and you may choose to do that. For flute, like you were saying, I love, as a flute player, especially, I love what, like, sort of tremolando kind of stuff that you can do with them. Now you have to be careful because they can't, there's certain things that they can't quite do, but things where they're sort of a fluttering, and if you have three or four of them doing that, it's like a string section. It's like a violin section doing it, only you get you get a more I guess busy quality. I feel like, ironically, there's less players, but it feels busier than like 10 or 12 violins doing it. And I think that's because with the flute, the notes, the motion of the notes is more pronounced than just, because each flute player is slightly different, and that's true of violins. They tend to be more homogeneous sounding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like doing certain things like that for flutes. Yeah, there's a whole, I could talk for hours just about writing for flute as well.
Yeah. Well, maybe another suggestion is maybe if we go through each instrument talking about maybe categories of how we use them to help other people.
Yeah.
Patches, so to speak, sounds, colors that we like.
Right.
And
obviously the most
ways that they can mute people, and like, for example, the flute, you should also think about woodwinds as a way of muting something. Yes, sometimes it's coloring something depending on its range and where it projects, but for brass, for example, like putting an alto flute or a bass flute in unison with a French horn, it sort of mutes it, but it's now coloring it and making it more mysterious. So, for those that don't know, as orchestrators, we're thinking of the character, the music, and going, okay, they wrote a solo horn and the music's mysterious. Is it really a solo horn, or is it a choir? Well, yeah, it's solo horn. Well, maybe it's better with a fiber mute because it takes some of the body and it makes it more mysterious. And now it's better with the bass flute in unison because it's adding even more mystery and it's muting the horn. And so that, just as a category of how we use woodwinds, is that sometimes they're just muting something, so to speak, or coloring it, or helping it project, or adding harmonics and overtones, and adding a piccolo above the trumpet, or as a way to make it pop more. Not that a trumpet ever really needs help
No, but like sometimes,
popping.
yeah, sometimes like for woodwinds too, like giving them a, a similar idea to brass. I was gonna say too, like obviously violins are playing a melody, having a flute player double it, that perfect choice, no big deal. That's more of, like you said, coloring. But like in often in especially video games, like you might have two trumpets playing like a minor second, like doing this and kind of crescendoing. One thing that's really great is to have the flutes, especially if the trumpets are playing higher, maybe more up in like this range, is to have the flutes trill that note like that, because it's actually creating a lot more tension, because the French horns can't play that high, so you really got the pure color of the trumpets up there, but the flutes are adding this like sort of it'll get clouded by the trumpets, don't worry. the trumpets
Yeah.
trumpets are going to project, but the flutes are adding sort of this motion in between it. And if you were to do that with the violins, it just sounds like a trill. But the flute, because it's going to be slightly colored, it just gives this like accent to that note, or to that swell, especially if they match the dynamics. So there's certain things that work really well for woodwinds, like you said, sort of masking certain things. Like I know, I really like trombones in straight mutes, like up high. Like this is kind of more Leroy Anderson, Nelson Riddle type of stuff. Like up in sort of around middle C, but flutes doubling those notes, because all of a sudden it doesn't sound like a trombone or a flute. It sort of sounds a different instrument. Um,
Yeah.
Certain things like that work really well.
Yeah, I was talking in a video a couple of weeks ago about Ravel's aesthetic of, fooling the listener and duping the listener,
Yeah.
seducing them. And that, that's something we do as orchestrators, that we're kind of seducing the listener sometimes by coloring things so that it's not a trumpet, it's not a trombone and a straight mute, which to some people that alone makes it, a completely different color and exotic to them. To a trombone player, it's just a trombone and a straight mute. But to somebody that, doesn't know a lot about trombone music, to color it with a mute,
Mhm.
that alone just goes, what is that sound? And then, like you said, adding flutes or high bassoons or whatever it is, that it becomes a whole new sound. And those are things we certainly love to exploit, is all of the color. And that's I think a lot of times, because strings are so homogeneous and brass is so homogeneous, that we look to the woodwinds as our special, special little
Mhm.
secret sauce of like, what is that sound? You're like, it's those people upstairs on the page that you don't really ever want to hire. Like they're the ones that just gave you that cool color that
No, it's. I mean, and even I think that the oboe is the hardest instrument
it is. Yeah.
to deal with, in terms of how it can color, but without sounding like Ravel or like
Yeah.
Beethoven or John Williams or whatever. Um, but I remember we came across this a couple years ago. There was trumpets and cup mutes, with oboes doubling it.
Yeah.
Very unique sound to having oboes play a lot with the trumpets. And um, I know there are a lot of times that we will actually have an oboe act as trumpet too. Like if
Sure.
if a trumpet's playing a melody and there's a harmony, sometimes it's actually better to have an oboe play it, because the listener all of a sudden starts thinking it's a trumpet.
Yeah, isn't there some joke about like an oboe player not showing up, like, oh, put a trumpet in a street mute, and then
Yeah,
you've got the oboe.
it's true, but and like I'm sure there might be people like wondering, well, why wouldn't you just have a trumpet too? Well, sometimes you don't get two trumpets.
Yeah, and these are the things as orchestrators we have these sort of rescue lists of I need this and I don't have it. Okay, so this plus this will get me close to
Right.
this,
The other reason too is that
like
sometimes
being MacGyver.
it is like being MacGyver, but sometimes too, trumpets playing, you know, in more of film scoring, I think when you have a melody and you have a harmony, sometimes a trumpet too, if it's in a lower-ish register, we're talking sort of middle C to the octave above, the trumpet too can project more than we need it to, and it means that trumpet one has to play louder, which means it starts to sound too brassy. So we would, instead of using a trumpet two, use an oboe, actually.
Or a cor anglais.
Yeah, and sometimes I find that when you do that, the first trumpet player can actually back off. There's actually a great video my wife and I were just watching of Bernstein, and he's yelling at the three trumpet
I
players.
think I saw, is this in London or something?
Yeah, everyone's probably seen it.
Yeah.
And my wife was laughing. She's like, "Well, what is his issue with it?" And I said, "Well, the problem is when the third trumpet and second trumpet have to play louder, they have to get brassier down there, and they lose their trumpet quality. There's a time and place for that, don't get me wrong, but sometimes we don't want it to be too brassy, so using an oboe to be a pseudo trumpet too is a good example of that. For those people in orchestration, like, staying away from, if you're trying to stay away from the cliches with the oboe, one thing to remember is that the oboe in a high register is a much pure sound than flutes. So oboes playing clusters up high with violins um, is a different kind of sound than sort of a breathy flute sound. So we might choose to do something like that. I mean, Ravel's a great example of oboes playing way too high. But
F
oboes,
sharp, G, no problem. But
yeah,
I mean, him and Strauss, made those ranges like you will learn to play up this high.
oh,
It became
I mean, and I know some oboe players can play quite a bit higher than that, but the idea of putting oboes up there is like it gives it, I think, a more pure sound, because an oboe player will play with less vibrato up there than a flute player will.
I think that's why Ravel liked writing them up there in tutti, because I mean, in his typical tutis, it's like oboes are as high as they can possibly go a lot of times, and you can say it's because they lose overtones or they become more flute-like up there.
Yeah,
But you could also say, well, aren't they stronger, a little bit lower and towards the top of the treble clef or in the staff, or, certainly way at the bottom where they project in a way that you don't want them to because they can be uncontrollable. But then it's like, well, yeah, if it's a tutti, you have the brass going. So who's going to win, a trumpet or, an oboe? And sometimes it's like, yeah, it does take on a flute-like quality up there. And then sometimes it's like nowhere else for it to go. So it's got to fly above. And I
yeah,
don't know, it's just something interesting too, that sometimes we do things as orchestrators because of color, and sometimes it's like that's all there is they can do in this particular gesture or dynamic or whatever. But I agree with you. That's also sometimes why we don't write oboes in unison with the strings sort of inside the treble clef, that they can sort of be too like rustic. And that's why sometimes a cor anglais is a better color
yep.
with the strings.
Or clarinet, like, that goes
Well,
back.
that, yeah,
Yeah,
of course, yeah.
that's more of the trick, I think, all the way back from Carl Stalling and Oliver Wallace and Ed Plum and all those guys, with when in the animation circuit, like in the 1920s and 30s, when the orchestras were like 25, 30 people. How did you, instead of having 16 violins, you only had 10? So what did you do? You always put a clarinet on the violins to thicken it up.
Yeah.
Which is a great trick too, by the way, if you're looking for not an oboe quality, because like you said, you put an oboe with the violins, you hear the oboe. It's one of my favorite sounds, but it's not always a sound that's needed for that particular moment. So
Yeah.
keeping the oboes, like you said too, like keeping the oboes towards the top of the register also creates a little bit more of a synth-like sound too. Like, especially around that high C up there and such. Like if they're playing more like in thirds and or they're holding long notes up there, I know that that's a really neat color for it, for blending maybe a high melody with something lower where you want you want to mirror maybe some of the composer's synths. We do that quite a bit, where we'll just
Sure.
put the oboes on like longer notes up there because one, they can breathe forever, and two, it does emphasize the synth, and it does
Yeah.
create those overtones in the room that you can't really do with a flute because all of a sudden it sounds too
Yeah.
fluty for them.
Well, let's talk about the way we use the oboe the most, which is pecking with string ostinati, and sometimes it's quite literal pecking. With a motor, I think the way I like using it, and you do, is more if there's maybe a running 16th gesture, sort of extracting what the accent pattern is, and just having the oboe sort of do accents. And that's something that, can, depending on the register, get absorbed, where it just adds more force and urgency to the violin, where it doesn't sound so much like an oboe. And probably, I mean, one, they're, oboes and bassoons are sort of, king and queen of staccato, but they're also just playing so short that you don't even get a chance to recognize
Yeah.
the color of it.
And it,
It's almost like a horn section, James Brown.
oh yeah.
Bup, 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 bup. So
If you're lucky enough to have the woodwinds in the room with the string players, it just means that the violins don't have to work so hard on the accents when that color is behind them.
yeah,
Because it's sometimes a passage is only tricky because of the accents, and you could spend, as like you could spend a half an hour on 4 bars trying to get it right, and
boy,
take,
yeah,
as soon as you take the accents away, all of a sudden it's fine. So sometimes just putting the oboes on there gives a little bit more support to the strings, especially if they're in the room together. If they're not,
yeah. And that's just a good general tip for composers, that using them just to be formulaic. You've got something going on in the strings. My cat is wanting to make an appearance here. You have something going on in the strings. You have an accent pattern. Extract the accents and stuff them in a bassoon or a cor anglais or an oboe. So they're just getting touches of it. Why not the brass? Because the brass is going to be too strident. Well, maybe you can get away with brass with mutes, which that's another thing that we do sometimes, because with mutes in, they sort of become woodwinds or they become a different color. But yeah, I'd say as a general typecast with how to get away with woodwinds is, I just sort of think, I grew up like a R&B funk guitar player. So sometimes I just think like James Brown and just the funkiness, the tightness of just jabbing and doing stabs and stuff like that.
yep.
But yeah, I guess going down the line, so I would have to say a lot applies for the cor anglais that it does for the oboe. I think for me, I love the cor anglais, the English horn, kind of with trumpets at times as a way to, just as a helper to add weight to things. I think is a great use for the cor anglais. So I don't know if you have any.
I mean, the English horn is literally my favorite instrument of all time.
In mine too. Yeah, that thing could play a solo forever over a string pad with rich, nines and 11s, and I could never get tired of that sound.
Here, especially sort of suspensions and things like that it would do in between melodies. But yeah, no, I think that the English horn is sort of the easiest instrument, and this is probably why it's found in film scoring more than in concert music, so to speak, is that in film scoring, it's oboe-like without being too oboe, because as composers have had to be sort of less musical in in their writing, they've had to do things, I think, more mid-range. I find certain
You're
things.
right. Yeah, mid-range and bass.
Yeah, it's a little thing. It just seems that the trend for a while was mid-range-ish music. And guess what instrument is mid-range? Or the English horn. So the English horn could play around middle C, because for those of you who aren't super familiar with the oboe really has much difficulty from the D above middle C to lower. It really cannot articulate very well down there, much less even just come have an entrance in.
And
It's
I would add, that's why we exploit those low notes from B flat up sometimes when you want something rude and uncontrollable and it's menacing. Like that's a perfect example of why you exploit the weakness of something or the ugliness of something.
right, and even then, I still find that they can't even articulate even at fortissimo. But that being said, that's why we go to the English horn is because what's sort of great about the English horn is that it can play in that range, and it doesn't have so much of that nasally sound that an oboe does. And it like you said, the English horn I feel like really second to clarinet probably colors the rest of the groups like the brass and the strings better than any of the other instruments. You know, second to clarinet, of course. But yeah, the English horn is one of my favorites because it tends to not be able to play high enough. So I feel like when it comes when we are using an English horn, we have to actually be be more technicians with it because it can't always play the melody because it's either out of range, it's either too low or too high. So it's
Mhm.
always doing this sort of extra thing, going between the two or three different ideas. And we
And that's the perfect thing to say. Yeah, as a helper, that I find that it's helping peck with the oboes, and now it's jumping onto trumpet melody or something and running with them. And now it's back here helping something. And it's really such a great instrument as a helper to just jump around gestures. I mean, that's
that being
exactly.
said too though, for those people who love John Williams, check out Jurassic Park, especially like the end credits. There's a lot of great things that he does with the English horn and an alto flute because the English horn playing a little bit higher that is easily an oboe range.
Yeah.
Um, the English horn has less of the oboe sound, but it gives clarity to a more fluffy note for a flute or alto flute. So and you know me, I probably overuse the English horn, but the English horn is a
And
great instrument to color flutes when you
yeah.
just want a little bit more of a distinction of the notes. Because
I
if
mean, check Daphnis and Chloe,
oh,
alto flute plus cor anglais.
oh,
And then when he wants to slightly vary that color, high bassoon and alto flute. So the bassoon replaces the cor anglais. Think where the bassoon has a little more point, the cor anglais has more point, the bassoon is a little bit tender there with the alto flute. And that's a great, combination,
yeah.
a patch idea for composers that aren't comfortable with woodwinds. Alto flute plus cor anglais, alto flute plus high bassoon unison.
Yep.
Awesome sound.
And even between like not just us as orchestrators, other orchestrators, you do still see the English horn jumping ship from idea to idea. It seems that it'll be playing with the flutes, and then it's all of a sudden playing with the French horns, and then all of a sudden it's kind of doing something with the violas. It's a really great, especially when violas often have the ostinato most of the time. The English horn can just outlie several of those notes too, because unless the ostinato is playable by the English horn um, or if it's one of those things where it's just instead of putting an English horn through torture of actually tonguing those notes, you might just give it because it's just emphasizing, it's just giving a bump to each of those notes.
Yeah,
You find the English horn, like I said, bridging the gap between a lot of things, which I feel is a good
absolutely.
segue into the clarinet too, though, because the clarinet, in my opinion, is the easiest instrument to color because
Yeah.
so again, this is orchestration instrumentation 101. You know your sort of ranges of the instrument, but study the clarinet because it it sounds different in each bit of its range. It really does, and you can exploit that. Like we love using the throat tones of a B flat
And
chord,
you hate using it up high.
using it up high, but I
I love it. But
yeah.
well, I just want to say, I don't mean to cut you off, that for beginning orchestrators or, composers that aren't comfortable with woodwinds, that don't think of a bassoon as a bassoon. I mean, think of all of these woodwinds as almost like, three different instruments in one
Mhm.
instrument. That, the bassoon down here from, I don't know, B flat to whatever, F or something. And it's like it projects, it can compete with trombones. And inside the staff, it's weaker. And that's why, you and I like putting them in unison with two bassoons and, A on the bass clef and above, that it starts becoming more tender. And it's like, it's a bassoon, but each part of its range evokes different things. And it's as if it's three different instruments in one. And I think that's maybe just a good general tip of woodwinds in general. I mean, clarinets are much more homogeneous and typically strong throughout the entire register.
But they color
But to think about it that way, that you're not just writing for a clarinet, that you've sort of got like three different ranges.
oh yeah.
Um,
And I
so
think that's why in wind bands you find more clarinets, is because as a section
yeah,
they just blend well together. But even in the orchestra, like I said earlier, especially in the old days of animation, they played everything. They played always an octave lower than the flute, or a third below the flute, or they're playing in unison with the violins on the melodies, because they're not only so agile, again, agility has a lot to do with a lot of these things we're talking about too, which is, why you should do some score study in terms of what these instruments can do. But the clarinet, like you said, it just, from its lowest to highest part of its range, it'll go with anything. There's very
yeah,
little, I feel like, that you would never do something with a clarinet.
yeah. I was reading somewhere someone liked to say that it sort of takes on any characteristic of the instrument that it comes after,
Yep.
and that it's such a neutral sound that if a flute is doing a solo and it gets dovetailed into a clarinet, I mean, obviously it's a different color, but it's absorbs some of the flute-like qualities, or if it follows in oboe or whatever, and we exploit that. And clarinets are just a great choir to make something sound more mysterious. I mean, I know you and I, like when there's low string pads, that if we want mystery, I mean, if we're not adding, say muted horns or tubin horns or whatever, that were probably my first go-to for mystery is a low clarinet choir with the strings. And that knowing when they just get absorbed into the strings, you don't even hear them, but like you said, they thicken something. Eugene Ormandy certainly knew that, because he called upon the clarinets all the time when he was augmenting people's scores to get the Philadelphia sound. And it's like cooking with a ton of butter and grease. He just used clarinets to fatten everyone up. Oh, oboes are playing in thirds, cool. Clarinets aren't doing anything, you're with the oboes.
And
It just thickens things.
right, like, and I think that's why in film scoring, if we are going to find woodwinds, we do find clarinets, probably flutes
Yeah.
and clarinets first.
Yeah.
But the nice thing too, for those of you who are, you want to use woodwinds and you're just like, I don't want it to sound too oboe-y, put a clarinet on it. Clarinet will actually soften the oboe sound. Put two clarinets on it and you really lose that distinctive oboe quality, but you still
My prejudice about clarinets in unison. And it's funny because some people just hate clarinets in octaves and they say it's out of tune. And I use clarinets in octaves a lot, but I like clarinets in unison in the Shalmo. And there was some color we did. I remember I was like, this sounds like synth. Was it a clarinet in the Shalmo with a cor anglais, or two clarinets with a cor anglais? But I remember there was something they did and they were pecking with a string motor, and it just had the coolest sound. And I remember writing that down, of that being a great color.
yeah. I mean, and again, they complement horns. If you only have two horns, you can often use clarinets, or you can use a bassoon. They really, like you said, they really color anything and thicken it or modify it I would find mostly a helpful way.
Yeah.
Why you find even in film scoring, clarinets playing an octave above French horns. It's like, well, they're just
Right.
emphasizing the overtones of that.
Yeah.
Why too you find clarinets playing in unison with the violin section melody, because you're like, oh, I just want a little bit more strength to it, but not an oboe sound and not the
Yeah.
vibrato of a flute. So you
Yeah.
just throw a clarinet on
Yeah.
it.
I remember talking to Conrad, and he was talking about well, I remember asking him, and there was a Harry Potter cue, and I kept saying, why do you keep putting the clarinet with the horn? And he said, oh, I'm doing that to make the horn seem even more melancholy, as a way of coloring it. but he was talking about this film Invincible that he did for Mark Isham, and there was something with the arc of the story, I haven't seen it, where just, as a way of sort of muting the character, that he kept putting a clarinet with the horn to mute the horn and not let it be as heroic. And towards the end of the film, as the arc of the story changed, he stripped away the clarinet and the horn became much more like a horn and heroic. And so that's a great way with the clarinet, that, I sort of think flute plus some brass instrument, more mysterious, clarinet plus some brass instrument, just more melancholy, more sadness.
Yeah,
I
especially
think that's
viola. I think that's the perfect word for clarinet and viola is it's melancholy.
yeah,
I think that it and maybe that would be a hindrance of it is that if you really looking for a more pure sound, you wouldn't do that and put a clarinet on. But often, if a viola is playing a melody, it probably is melancholy. So I think that that would probably be a perfect example of when to do that.
yeah,
And sometimes I've seen, I think the typical thing that most people would think of is, if there's a cello, if a cello section solely, oh, put a bassoon on it because that's a tenor instrument like the cello. But a clarinet actually is a somewhat more somber sound. The bassoon I feel like is more
yeah,
direct, and a clarinet will give you that not only a melancholy sound, but I think it actually, I think it gives it kind of more of a silvery sound too.
yeah, I agree.
Obviously cello playing up above middle C is going to be a more silvery sound anyway, but the
Yeah,
clarinet kind of uh, amplifies that in a way.
it's funny with, the book that I love for orchestration, Charles Coquelin, his study of orchestration. He talks about one of the beginning mistakes of orchestrators is writing sonorities where they don't know how powerful that they're going to be,
Mm.
and that most people over orchestrate. You being a teacher, that there's too many notes in the page, and the beauty of orchestration sometimes is you score study and something sounds massive and there's like only a little bit in the page. You're like, wait. And for me, one of the things I learned, when I was orchestrating in the beginning, was like, there's no way to to hide a bass clarinet. Like, that thing has so much body. And I remember working on a film, when I was working on Boxing Day, that rom-com, and using the bass clarinet sort of even in the middle register, and just like, boy, that thing projected. And I used it with trombones, and it's just, I always am in awe of how much that instrument projects and how it's really hard to hide that instrument.
No, actually, I'd say the one example I can think of where it does is I remember this. I still can. This is probably over 20 years old now. Is in Duel of the Fates from Star Wars. I remember like the opening, the choir comes in, and then all of a sudden the violas come in. Whatever they're doing their thing, but a bass clarinet is actually holding the low E while the cello they're sort of pounding away. And I remember hearing that the first time and thinking, did the pianist leave the sustain pedal down, like on the E? Like, because it kind of sounded like that. It sounded like it washed in the room. And I remember looking at the score later and being like, huh, why is the bass clarinet holding a note? And your ear didn't go to that right away, which I would
Yeah,
say,
it's
yeah.
such a strong instrument. I mean, in like Daphnis and Chloe, like with Ravel tutis, I mean, he does this in other places as well, but like, he actually uses the bass clarinet as the fifth of the brass chord.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, for a few reasons. I mean, one, he's writing brass in a more, he's writing brass in a more brilliant register, because that's what he values, and he wants more brilliance, where, as a lot of composers want darkness and thickness. But it's also because, a lot of people say that the tuba is not necessarily a great bass instrument for the trombones, that a contrabass trombone, just because of the fullness of the tuba.
Yeah.
But when you think of the fullness of a bass clarinet, that's great, as the fifth, when you have a tuba and a bass clarinet, like, that is a fat fifth going through. And then he would use the trombones up in the tenor clef, not even down in the bottom. And
It's almost like you're talking about Pines of the Appian Way.
I
'Cause
don't know that.
no, no,
Yeah,
it's just like that because it's sort of like, Respighi would kind of use the bass clarinet, sort of, it kind of snakes its way in a little bit for in the melody, but as you listen to those low kind of like kind of things pounding, obviously the bass is, they're playing a scordatura B. So the bass clarinet just emphasizes like any of those low thundery tones. Like you said,
yeah,
it rarely is hidden. It's just an instrument
yeah,
you can't really hide, except for what I like to use it is its upper range. Instead of going to a clarinet, I do
sure.
love higher bass clarinet stuff. And sort of notating it up there. Again, we kind of find this more sort of in our thriller horror video game stuff where we need something really ominous and scary, but they don't want synths and they don't want like violins and strings to do, screechy kinds of things. And just putting high bass clarinets in clusters, or like I know you really like to use a lot of the excuse me, um the sort of multiphonics up there. The bass
Yeah,
clarinet is so great for that kind of creepy eerie stuff. uh,
yeah.
but yeah, it's an instrument that is sort of it to me feels like it could almost be the base of the woodwind section at times. uh,
Yeah, Jordan and I are lucky with one of the games that we work on. I was saying we get wins and fours. So there's scenarios where we'll have like, I mean, typically we're using two clarinets in B flat, and a bass clarinet, and then either a contra alto clarinet or a contra bass clarinet.
mhm.
So we sort of have the whole range, and we have clarinet in E flat and clarinets in A. Um, and we sort of have the whole range of the clarinet, family. And I think we were even thinking about getting rid of the contrabass clarinet sometimes, or having them go to contra alto. And I know some orchestrators prefer the contra alto because it's more agile and it's less, of a noisy contraption for recording than the contrabass clarinet. But the contrabass clarinet is great for like the Godzilla stuff and just all the heavy dinosaurs and monsters and that kind of stuff. So the low clarinet family is great to exploit when you have all that stuff.
Yeah, and we tend to use them, I would say, more sparingly because we like the emphasis of, sforzatos or forte piano. Give them the hit, but not the sustain.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's a great thing. Like, what do you do when you've got when you have the luxury of having a bunch of low people, and you have contrabassoon and bassoons, and you've got low clarinets, and what do you do? Do you have the whole herd moving, and how do you want to break things up? And yeah, I think that having bassoons and or contra, pecking things, there's less body, there's more articulation, and having clarinets just come in at key points because it's also adding fullness, because as orchestrators we're always thinking about a lot of things, register, color, but the fullness of a note and the thinness of a note. And just in terms of clarity, bassoons pecking and a bass clarinet getting touches of it, it's sort of like adding low end real quick and taking it out, and it's a cleaner sound. And that's not to say that a bass clarinet can't do that. I mean, because as orchestrators know, of course, the agility of clarinets. I mean, if anyone can do those synth like arpeggiation, like the old CS80 stuff, sequencer sounding stuff, clarinets are amazing at that, as well as flutes, of course.
Yeah, and I think too, like it's kind of slightly off topic, but not really. It's like we both work on projects where we have no budget, and then are blessed sort of in this way where that in that particular project we do get a lot more woodwinds. That being said, though, like I'm proud that we don't go overboard with them in terms of just because we have four clarinets or we had five at one time, didn't we?
I think so.
Yeah, like you still as an orchestrator, you want to be mindful to not just say, well, we have a contrabass clarinet, so we're going to give them everything. No, we're actually really careful about it. And I know I've had other colleagues say, well, then why do you hire? It's like, well, we have the budget for it. The composers like it. We're not going to change the sound. We've sort of created this vibe with it, even though they might only play like hits here and there, or they might hit a sustained, there's less for them to do. It's a color we appreciate, and
Yeah,
we're not going to just plaster the page with every single note because they can do it. we're
yeah.
we're more considerate of of the color of it. So
I know one of your critiques to me sometimes is I love using the woodwinds, that you'll be like, Ella, this just sounds like wind band music.
as someone who grew up,
As someone who loves wind band, and grew up playing wind band, even you
I
were
know,
like,
I know,
Ella, chill on the woodwinds. Like, it's a little too wind bandy here.
I know.
And
It's
I've even, yeah, I've no names mentioned, but some amazing orchestrators, have said those things even with their own orchestrations, or even like looking at mine, like, oh, this is great here, but I'd probably add some pizzicati here so it doesn't seem so wind band like, you know.
I only played in a
It's like a dirty word. It's so sad.
No, it's I think that, like, having played in an orchestra, there's an orchestral sound to it, and for wind bands, they their sonority is slightly different. But their music is different. That's the thing that's great, is like I absolutely love a lot of Holst wind band music or Persichetti stuff. But it's different. It's not the same as playing Ravel. It's why Ravel didn't write for a wind band, even though he probably would have been great at it. There's a certain stylistic thing, and having an orchestral video game score means we just kind of stay in that vibe with it. Not that a wind band vibe would be bad. It's just that we've already created for so many years the orchestral thing, and then to have sometimes it's more or less just what we end up stripping out some of the woodwinds, because again, we don't get to use them a lot, so I think, just get excited.
Of course we do. Yeah. I mean, I get depressed. There's been projects that I've orchestrated on and started, orchestrating the woodwinds, and then they just go, actually, we're going to cut the woodwinds out. And I just get so depressed, because that's
Oh yeah.
just where I have the most fun, because I have fun working on any music, and as orchestrators that work for other people, we're obviously there to help and not, make the music sound like us, make it sound like them. But it's just so mentally engaging and fun to work with woodwinds, because you're really, I don't know, I just feel like a crafts person. I'm really, just so engaged with the woodwinds and how they can help people out, just for the last however long we've been talking about them and all the different things we can do. And so when that gets taken off of the color palette, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
well, the brass is homogeneous, so unless I use some mutes, like, that's one color, and the strings, and of course I'm sure the writing's different and the textures, but yeah, to lose the woodwinds is like, oh, I just felt like I just got so many colors stripped away.
Yeah, and especially because I think as orchestrators, that's where we have somewhat of the most freedom.
That's true too. Yeah,
A composer is
absolutely.
delivering MIDI, they've most of the time fairly thorough in their string and brass writing in
Yeah.
terms of what they want. Like we still may change a few things, but the ideas are there, and then they might not be sure of what to, and I've worked, no composers mentioned here, but I worked with some composers where they will literally say add woodwinds, and just a project marker, add woodwinds.
Sure. Same.
And
Yeah.
we're and that's fine, that hey, that's part of the job, because they may have not had time, and that's why I'm not it's not a critique of them, it's just they may not have had time
Yeah.
to go back and add woodwind. So
And that gets into a whole hornet's nest of, well, is that orchestration? Is that arranging? Do you get paid for this? And
um,
it's kind of a tricky answer. I mean, ideally, yeah, you should get paid for it, and it should be additional arranging, because but some people would say, well, maybe you're just copying and pasting the violin into the flute. That's not arranging, I'm
yeah,
not paying you for that. So
right, no, it does go down the
it's a
route.
fine line. But yeah, it's fun, because I mean, I tell students sometimes that when you sort of look at a page of orchestration, sometimes that, maybe one choir has harmony and another choir is doing something else. But when you look at the winds, it's sort of like they're picking up on a bunch of different ideas, how we were talking about the cor anglais as a helper and jumping around, that the woodwinds are like, oh, I see they're helping, the strings on this melody, and now they're pecking here, and they're sort of doing like 2 and 3 jobs within the choir itself. And that's, to me, I just have so much fun because as I look, up and down my page, especially if the composer didn't write for winds, it's like, okay, now how can they help? All right, I'm going to do this here, and that's going to make that sound more this here. And oh, this is somber. Okay, so we're going to add this here. And yeah, that's just so fun and engaging.
Yeah.
I wonder if the script will ever flip and all of a sudden like strings are out of vogue and it's just wind band music that they want. It's just like, just give us nothing. I mean, Hans sort of got away with that with Interstellar, although pipe organ as well, but where it's like, we don't want strings.
Yeah, I mean, I think they still did record strings for that, but
Yeah, they did.
I think that with woodwinds, and again, we said this at the beginning, is that because they are so distinct in color, they just require more thought. Which is why, like I said, no critique to composers. I get everyone's under a deadline. It's why they start writing for the strings first, add some brass, and then say, "Oh my goodness, I have to write 10 more minutes of music." Okay, the orchestrator will make that work.
And as orchestrators, it takes us a long time to do winds, depending on the passage.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
There's a lot of hand-holding involved rather than, we sweat every bar, but
No, the woodwinds are the trickiest because there's certain things, and I find, again, this is more orchestration 101 and instrumentation. It's like I constantly, as an orchestrator, look at the woodwind parts more so and think about the technical aspect of it too. Like, okay, I'm a string player. Like, the only time I ever got tired in my life was playing a Mendelssohn symphony once. Like, we don't get tired, but brass players do, and composers know that. And the way that they write for brass, not all, but most, the way that they write for brass is a little bit more lenient on their duration of playing. Okay, a French horn melody. Okay, now they're resting, and then as orchestrators, we, especially you and I, on some of these things that we worked on together, we come in and we definitely make sure that there are breath places and that, like, okay,
Sure.
we're not going to put the brass here. They need some time to rest. The woodwinds, nobody thinks about that, and so we have to not only think about, can a clarinet actually play this? Is this out of range for an oboe? How hard is it for the oboe to articulate middle C for 19 bars in a way? It's impossible. I'm telling you all, it's really hard. But like, there's that aspect, and then the color on top of it. So it's like, it's sort of, threefold, because again, the woodwinds need more hand-holding. They really do. And it's probably why they're the least used and sort of the most forgotten, is because it just requires more time, and composers don't have more time. They just don't.
And the fatigue thing that we talked about in the beginning, that's why there's string quartet music and string choirs, and we sort of can just, somewhere there's a percentage of, I'm gonna misquote, but like strings 85%, brass this, woodwinds like 30%, in terms of just how much they're used in an orchestra.
Yeah, well,
and literally how much time they occupy.
Well, it actually, and that's a good point, that it's something that's actually changed too, is that I forget who was, someone at USC gave us kind of a breakdown like that. They said that the human ear can listen to strings for like a certain amount of time, like hours, before the ear actually gets fatigued. The next group of instrument used to be the woodwinds, or maybe.
Oh, interesting. Before the brass.
Yes, and then it was
okay.
And then percussion. Like, there's only so many hours before you get tired of hearing a snare drum play. But what's interesting too is think about how the score is arranged. I tell this to my students: why are the woodwinds on top and the strings on the bottom? Well, look at starting in the Baroque period all the way through all the way till now, well, until film scoring came about. But the instruments that played the most were on the top and bottom, the woodwinds and the strings. They played the most, and the instruments that played the least were in the middle. So your eye could see the most active instruments. Well, what a world are we in now where that has completely changed? It's like, there are no woodwinds in the score even half the time. And so maybe that's what has sort of tipped the scales a bit, I think, in terms of what our ears can actually listen to. That would be an interesting thing for someone to run that percentage now.
I've seen it written somewhere. I don't know if it was in an orchestration book, or I love reading like a lot of, doctoral thesis articles on different things. I definitely saw there was some sort of pie chart or something, some kind of graph just showing how little the woodwinds were used. And Mooney wanted to come say hello again. What up, buddy? It's Catterday.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. Well, I think we've talked a ton about Woodwinds. If anyone is still listening, you're amazing.
Yeah.
And again, if anyone has any questions, Jordan and I both teach privately, and if there's any topics that you would like us to address in another video, I'm sure I know I'd be happy to, and if Jordan has time, I'm sure he'd be happy to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna feed this little guy and take care of some stuff. So yeah, it was great chatting with you. And for those listening, thank you for checking us out. And hopefully we'll check you on the next one.
Sounds good.
Okay.